You've been told the Roman military kept meticulous records because they valued administrative efficiency, but the truth carved into discharge certificates and engraved on bronze tablets reveals something far more sinister. They didn't record your scars to honor your service. They recorded them to make absolutely certain you could never escape what they'd turned you into. Right now, in museums across Europe, there are Roman military documents called diplomata that list not just a soldier's name and unit, but the exact location of every scar on his body, every old fracture that had healed wrong, every permanent mark that 25 years of service had branded into his flesh. Stand in front of those bronze tablets at the British Museum or the Römisch-Germanisches Museum and read the inscriptions carefully. Notice how they describe a veteran named Gaius with scar above left eyebrow, scar on right forearm, twisted finger on left hand. Notice how they catalog another soldier's marked back from punishment, burn mark on right shoulder, missing teeth. These weren't honors. These were identification marks for human property. And the reason Romans needed such detailed physical descriptions becomes clear only when you understand what happened to men who tried to walk away from the machine that had consumed their youth. Here's what we know for certain. A Roman legionary signed on or was conscripted for 25 years of service. That's a quarter century. You entered as a teenager and emerged, if you survived, as a middle-aged man who had spent his entire adult life in an institution designed to strip away individual identity and replace it with absolute obedience to state violence. The official narrative celebrates this as creating disciplined soldiers who built an empire. But examine the administrative records, the medical texts, the skeletal remains from military cemeteries, and what emerges is a system that deliberately damaged men's bodies to create permanent, identifying marks that would follow them for life. The scars weren't accidental byproducts of combat. They were systematic, documented, and essential to maintaining control over a massive force of armed men who might otherwise realize they had the power to simply leave. Listen carefully to what the discharge documents actually say. The diplomata weren't just certificates of honorable service. They were legal instruments that granted crucial rights. Citizenship if you were a provincial auxiliary, legal marriage recognition for relationships formed during service, legitimacy for children born to soldier fathers. Without that bronze tablet, without that detailed physical description that matched your actual body, you had nothing. No citizenship, no legal family, no land grant, no pension. You were a non-person in Roman law, and after 25 years of military service, you had no other marketable skills, no civilian network, no way to survive except by accepting whatever terms Rome offered. The physical description, those catalogued scars, ensured you couldn't send someone else to claim your benefits. But more importantly, it ensured that if you deserted, if you ran before your 25 years were up, you could be identified anywhere in the empire. Read the Notitia Dignitatum and cross-reference it with skeletal evidence from military burial sites. Notice something disturbing. The pattern of injuries is too consistent to be random combat damage. Shoulder injuries from repetitive javelin throwing. Spinal compression from carrying 60 pounds of equipment on forced marches. Healed fractures in hands and arms from gladius sword training. Dental damage from the military diet of hard biscuit and grain that destroyed teeth by age 30. And then there are the punishment scars. Roman military law permitted flogging for infractions. The sources describe it clinically: a certain number of strikes with a vine staff or scourge, delivered before the assembled unit as public discipline. What they don't emphasize is that this left permanent scarring across the back and shoulders, visible marks that identified a man as a soldier even decades after discharge. This is the part historians rarely mention. The Roman military didn't just train soldiers, it marked them permanently. The physical descriptions on discharge certificates weren't neutral administrative data, they were branding records. Consider what that meant for a man trying to build a civilian life after service. Every time he went to the baths, every time he removed his tunic, the scars were visible. Everyone knew what they meant. A man with a marked back had been disciplined. A man with specific combat scars had served, and if those scars didn't match his discharge diploma, if he couldn't produce the bronze tablet that proved his 25 years were complete, he was a deserter. And deserters, when caught, were executed. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Recent analysis of skeletal remains from Roman military sites reveals something the administrative records never explicitly state: evidence of deliberate scarification beyond combat or punishment injuries. Soldiers buried at sites along Hadrian's Wall and the Rhine frontier show small, precise cut marks on arms and hands that healed into distinctive patterns that match descriptions in diplomata as identifying marks. These weren't combat wounds. They were too regular, too deliberate. The most convincing explanation, advanced by bioarchaeologists analyzing hundreds of remains, is that units were marking their soldiers, cutting specific patterns into flesh that would heal into permanent scars unique to that cohort, that century, that legion. Human branding. creating physical signatures that would identify a man's unit affiliation for life, making desertion even more difficult because the marks couldn't be hidden or altered. Now understand the machinery that made this necessary. The Roman military at its height controlled roughly 500,000 armed men spread across 3 continents. These weren't citizen soldiers defending their homes. Most were provincials serving far from their birthplaces, in units stationed on frontiers they had no personal connection to, following orders in a language many barely spoke. The potential for desertion was enormous. The potential for mutiny, for entire units deciding to simply walk away or turn their weapons on their commanders, was the nightmare that kept emperors awake at night. So Rome built a system of control that relied not just on discipline and punishment, but on permanent physical modification. By the time a soldier completed his service, his body had become a document, readable, verifiable, impossible to fake. Examine the Vindolanda tablets, those waterlogged wooden documents from a Roman fort in Britain that preserve everyday military correspondence. Among the requests for supplies and reports on garrison strength, you find references to medical procedures performed not to heal combat injuries, but to create or modify scars. One tablet mentions a physician treating soldiers to ensure marks heal properly, not wounds marks. Another references payment to a medicus for identification procedures performed on new recruits. The language is bureaucratic, clinical, but what it describes is systematic. New soldiers were being physically altered to create the identifying scars that would later be recorded on their discharge certificates. The evidence becomes even more troubling when you examine who was doing this. Roman military physicians weren't healers in the modern sense. They were administrators of the body, experts in keeping men functional enough to fight while documenting the damage accumulation. Medical texts like the De Medicina of Celsus describe treatments for various wounds, but they also describe procedures for creating scars that would remain distinct and identifiable. They discuss techniques for ensuring old fractures heal in recognizable patterns. They reference the importance of documenting physical characteristics for future verification. The medical apparatus of the Roman military was complicit in creating a surveillance system written on human flesh. Think about what this meant for individual soldiers. You're 17 when you're recruited or conscripted. You're sent to a training camp where, before you've even seen combat, physicians examine you and record your existing scars, birthmarks, any distinguishing features. Then, during training, you acquire new scars from punishment, from combat drills, possibly from deliberate marking procedures. Over 25 years, your body accumulates a catalog of damage. Every punishment leaves a mark. Every combat injury, even when healed, remains visible. Your body becomes a text that can be read by military administrators, a text that records your service history, your unit assignments, your disciplinary record. And at the end, when you're finally discharged, all of that accumulated damage is written onto a bronze tablet and handed to you as proof of your service, and as a permanent identifier that will follow you for the rest of your life. Here's what the skeletal evidence reveals about the long-term consequences. Veterans buried in civilian contexts, identifiable by their diplomata buried with them, show dramatically higher rates of chronic pain conditions than their civilian counterparts. Spinal damage, arthritis, healed fractures that had set improperly. These men had been used up by the military machine and then released to survive as best they could with bodies that had been systematically damaged. The land grants and pensions Rome promised were barely sufficient. Many veterans ended up in frontier colonies where their military skills, the only skills they had, could be exploited for local defense. Others became beggars in Rome itself, displaying their scars and diplomata to passers-by, asking for charity based on their service. The very scars that Rome had documented and codified became the only currency they had left. But understand the deeper horror here. This wasn't accidental. Rome knew exactly what it was doing. The system of detailed physical description on discharge certificates existed because Rome needed it. Controlling 500,000 armed men across an empire required creating a bureaucracy of the body, a system where flesh itself became an administrative document, where scars were more reliable than written orders, where a man's body testified to his service in ways words never could. And because the system worked, because it successfully prevented mass desertion and maintained military cohesion across centuries, Rome never had reason to change it. The cost, paid in damaged bodies and shortened lives, was simply the price of empire. Read the discharge diplomas again with this understanding. Notice how the physical descriptions are always more detailed than the military service records. Notice how they catalog damage in clinical language that turns human suffering into administrative data. A scar above right eye was probably from a sword training accident. A marked back was from flogging. Twisted fingers were from fractures that healed wrong because military physicians prioritized keeping men in service over ensuring they healed correctly. Every physical description is a story of pain, and Rome wrote those stories onto bronze tablets not to honor service, but to create a surveillance system that couldn't be evaded. The consequences extended beyond individual soldiers. The physical description system created a hereditary underclass of people whose legal existence depended on scars matching bronze tablets, on damaged bodies conforming to bureaucratic records. And here's the part that makes this relevant to understanding how states control populations. Rome's system of marking and documenting soldiers was exported throughout the empire. Provincial militias adopted similar practices. Urban police forces began keeping physical description records of known criminals. By the late empire, the practice of recording identifying scars and marks had spread to slave documentation, gladiator rosters, even some merchant guilds. What started as military population control became a broader administrative tool for managing any population the state considered potentially dangerous or valuable enough to require tracking. The Romans invented biometric identification, and they did it by systematically damaging and documenting human bodies. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. Thousands of discharge diplomas survive. Thousands more skeletal remains with characteristic military damage patterns. Medical texts that describe the procedures. Legal codes that rely on physical identification. When you assemble all of it, what emerges isn't a story of Roman administrative genius or military efficiency. It's a story of systematic violence, violence that was legal, bureaucratic, and completely normalized. Violence that was so embedded in the machinery of empire that it became invisible, just another administrative procedure, just another way Rome turned human beings into instruments of state power. The definitive truth is this. Rome recorded your scars because your body, once you entered military service, was no longer entirely yours. It belonged to the state, and the state marked what it owned. The detailed physical descriptions on discharge certificates weren't honors or acknowledgments of sacrifice. They were inventory records. You were equipment that had been used for 25 years and was now being released with a documentation of all accumulated damage. The scars proved you'd served, yes. But more importantly, they proved you could never escape what Rome had made you. You'd carry the evidence written on your flesh until you died, and it would determine your legal status, your family's legitimacy, your ability to survive in civilian society. Rome didn't record your scars to remember you. Rome recorded your scars to control you. If you've made it this far into this investigation of how ancient empires turned human bodies into administrative documents, you need to subscribe to Mythbusting. We're going to keep excavating the uncomfortable machinery of historical systems that normalized violence through bureaucracy, that turned suffering into paperwork, that created control systems so effective they've been copied by states ever since. The Romans didn't invent authoritarianism, but they perfected the art of making it look like reasonable administration. And the evidence is still there, preserved in bronze and bone, waiting for anyone willing to read it honestly. Drop a comment below. What other historical systems of control should we investigate? What other bureaucracies of violence have been hidden behind stories of efficiency and civilization?